Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of the System 2 podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of having Lara on with me. She is a social worker. She has worked in a number of different roles, so is also a professor. Thank you so much, Lara, for being on the show.
Sure, I'm happy to be here.
So, what's your story? Take us back.
Man, that's a broad question. So I am originally from New Jersey. I grew up pretty much outside of the city and New York City. And I don't know, I went to the University of and quickly learned that I couldn't really do anything with my bachelor's of science in human services. So I went and got a master's of social work, and I did that at Fordham, and I lived at my parents' house. I commuted. Um, Started out in social work in New York, lived there for a while, and then I moved to Denver when I met my now husband. So actually, that's not totally true. We met and I said, I'm not moving to Denver. And then it was more like, I'm not moving to Denver until we get married. And then we got engaged, and then I was like, oh, I guess I'm moving to Denver. So that's like the broad level view.
What attracted you to social work? Were you interested in that from when you were a kid? What were you like growing up? What were your interests?
Yeah, I think I was interested in it as a kid without knowing what it was. Like some people who had exposure to social workers knew that that was a path that they wanted to follow. I more so wanted to help people. I think that, I was into sports and into like Broadway. I don't know. I had like a varying amount of interests, but I think what was always consistent was like finding that person who needed a little help or a little kindness or just something, and wanting to see what that was and being curious about people and curious about like their stories and their challenges. So that was always kind of present for me.
Did your parents emulate any of that? Like, were they also curious and interested in people, or do you remember like how you got exposed to that line of work?
Yeah, well, the exposure to the line of work was more around like following the breadcrumbs. It was like, okay, I learned about basic human services in grad school or in undergrad, and then learned that there wasn't much I could do without a master's. And that was probably my first time hearing about social work was in college. Um, Back to like my parents and my childhood, I think my parents have always been interested in people and their stories, but I'm a bit of the black sheep, I would say. Like they're more into the arts. Like my grandfather was a cartoonist and he loomed really large in like the family story, and my brother demonstrated like a lot of the talents that he did, that my grandfather did. And so comedy and cartooning and humor, all that was very pervasive in my family. And so I think I was attracted to just a different side of people.
Interesting. Say more about your grandfather as a cartoonist. What do you mean? You said that he loomed large. What are some examples, some stories about him?
Yeah. Well, so he is, or he was one of the original founders of, or I'm sorry, one of the original artists of Mad Magazine and had a pretty commercial career. I feel like people of our generation don't really know him, but those before us do. So he grew up in the Bronx. He was sort of like he was the fourth child in a Jewish family in the Bronx and had this artistic talent. And he served in World War II. He then tried to make a career for himself, and he did. And so he had commercial success with Mad Magazine, and he drew a comic strip for Playboy. And so he had all this. I mean, he had success, I think, by any definition. And so I think one of the unwritten rules was in my family was you could follow your dreams. You could have a dream that was large or perhaps like not really tenable by many people, and you could do it because he did it. He was a poor kid from the Bronx who made a living for himself doing something that he was passionate about. And then, you know, when it came to like first of all, his art is all over my parents' house. Like I there's probably you could count the pieces that are not his. So he's like physically all over. And then I think My father is an editor for television, and he's done some documentaries as well, and he's kind of put his career, or he's wanted to place his career in a place where he can tell my grandfather's story as well. And so everyone's kind of oriented themselves to him in some way. Like my mom has like I am the daughter of him, and it's a very kind of um, like love infused daughter's vision of her father. And then my dad has more of this like his story needs to be told. And then my brother is like he participates in like the New York comic scene, and he does some editing, and he writes and he produces and he does all this stuff. And so I think he's tried to use his talents to form a career as well. Where some maybe, in other families or other examples, like the messaging is like, yeah, you have this dream, but like you need to also, maybe make money and, put your dreams aside. That was not the story that was told for us.
That's so cool. And it's yeah, to your point, like to be able to make a living as a cartoonist, but not just make a living, to be very successful at it is amazing. And it's what was it like, I guess, growing up for you? It sounds like your brother followed in your grandpa's footsteps. Were you ever tempted to go down a more artistic route?
No. I have memories of like my grandfather and my brother sitting at the table, and my grandfather telling my brother like what to do or how to, they drew together, they painted together, they did a lot together, and I loved being around it, but it was never, I don't know why it was never either nurtured in me, or maybe I just didn't express interest. I don't really remember. I think one of the funny things, my husband likes to like joke about this, but like because he drew for Playboy, like he was a cartoonist for Playboy, there was like a lot of boobs around, and that was like sort of normal. And I do remember being a kid and like drawing my Disney princesses and drawing like a curve for like cleavage, which now that I look back on that and have daughters of my own, I'm like, that's weird. Like, I don't think other little girls were drawing cleavage on their drawings. Yeah, but I think, when I say he loomed large, like I think he his story was so interesting and it was so discussed that it was almost like when asked like tell us a fun fact about you, I would talk about him kind of thing. So I think there's pros and cons to this story. And I think part of that was like the excitement and admiration around him took focus. But then yeah, I mean as a kid I don't remember, like I have my own sort of creative soul, I would say, but I don't participate really in any artistic endeavors.
His cartoons generally playful? Do they ever get political? Because you can do a lot, obviously, in that medium. Which direction did he take it in?
Um, yeah, I think highly political, highly satirical. Like those who know about Mad Magazine, especially in like its early form, it was highly critical. It was sort of a voice of the times, like a satirical, comical, first of its kind voice of the time. And we're talking about the 1950s. Um, I mean, he did work that was banned. I don't think it was for Mad that he did work that was banned, but he did things that were banned. And so, like, as the story goes, it was very influential to today's, like, American comedic flavor. So, like the National Lampoon and the, um, you know, Stephen Colbert, Conan O'Brien, like these kind of figures were fans of the Mad magazine art and story of the time of when it came out. So, I think it was highly influential and pretty controversial. Like parents didn't want their kids reading it kind of thing.
Yeah, wow. And you mentioned that your father has been involved in some projects about the life of your
Yeah.
grandfather. Yeah, what kind of things has he done?
Yeah, and I should mention this is my mom's dad. So he, his father-in-law is who he's doing things for, and my grandfather's long passed, but my dad put out, I guess you could call it a coffee table book. God, a long time ago. I don't even know how long ago. It was called The Mad Playboy of Art. And so he put together this book with a publisher, and he's been working on this documentary for very, 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 very long time. At times, it has become a family affair. Like, we all traveled to California. We went to the Playboy Mansion as a family. So we've had like some kind of funny experiences as a family that have been like internally sort of normal. Like, not that we frequented the Playboy Mansion, but it was like, okay, like we're gonna tell. I would call him Pop Pop. So we're gonna tell Pop Pop's story, and we got to talk to Hugh Hefner. So like we're gonna go to the Playboy Mansion. Like that's not like a crazy thought. The craziest part about it was like getting it to happen. But so
Well, what was that like? Yeah, like going into the Playboy Mansion.
it was kind of cool. I remember I think it was, let's see, 2010 or 11. Um, we flew out to California, and um, there was like a production aspect to it where like I was taking pictures and my brother was, putting the mic, and my mom was just there, like, as her father's daughter, and my dad was filming and asking questions. And so we all had like a part to play, and then we got a tour. And like at this time, that was, I feel like, that the TV show was on. So it was like a place to be, and there were things going on. But I do remember feeling like this guy's just like an old guy. Like he has this like lore about him and this public image, but he is just like an old guy with old interests. And yeah. So I mean it was cool. It was a really cool experience.
Yeah, I mean, this sounds, yeah, it sounds really interesting to see that part of your grandpa's life and
Yeah.
the impact that it had. How, I don't know, what, I guess, yeah, like what was your grandpa like in his later years as that world of the 1950s and all that change and the controversy that he started through Mad Magazine and entering the era that we are more familiar with.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, what was he like?
I mean, for me, he was just my grandpa. Like, and I'm sure my other grandfather, my dad's dad, passed away when I was in 3rd grade. So I didn't have like the length of a relationship with him, so I can't compare whether or not this grandfather was a normal one or not. But he was the story I am told, and the experience I've had with him in my life was very normal. And like despite his public persona and the avenues of which he achieved success being like, salacious and controversial, he was very intellectual and very normal. And from what I understand, it was this kind of commercial cartoon avenue that paid the bills, but his artistic interests were far more classical. Like he went to, I think it's LaGuardia now, but it was the High School of Music and Art. And so he's like a classically trained artist, and his personal work was all very, um, like oil paintings, and he painted us, and he, just kind of had more of a serious side. So he passed away in 2008 when I was, I think, 21. And he lived out his last few years in a nursing home. He had Parkinson's. And I remember I was in college, and I felt we were very close. And I would go visit him whenever I was home from college. And I really wanted him involved in my life. And so I remember like I made this like little book of like the university that I was at, and like I put pictures in it, and I put like where I went to school, because I wanted him, like he would never be able to come visit me, but I wanted that connection. So I gave him this book of like, here's where my dorm is, and here's where my classes are, and here's what the campus looks like. And when I would come home, I would visit him, and we would do puzzles together. Like I got one of those like those mats that roll up that you could transport a puzzle around. So I feel like I was very invested in having a relationship with him that like honored the things we liked to do together, even in like his later years and like his diminishing physical abilities, because his mental ability was always there. He was an avid reader. We talked a lot about books. I love to read too. And so we had this kind of like, we might not have shared a creative bond, but we had those things. We also had the Yankees. Like I remember I would come and watch like the playoff games with him, and he was a huge Yankee fan. That was kind of the basis of our relationship at the end of his life.
Was he? a funny guy outside of work? Did
Yeah.
he that side of him carry through?
Yeah, he was really funny, and I remember, like, as a kid, he was really silly, and now now that I'm an adult, I'm like, "Oh my god," like, my poor grandma had to, like, rein him in, like, I remember we would go for ice cream, and he would, like, throw whipped cream at us, like, he was silly on our level as kids, like, me and my brother, and he was like also just kind of odd. Like I remember there was one time he had to babysit just me and I don't remember why and he lived down the street from a hospital in New Jersey and he took me to the hospital cafeteria for lunch instead of making a sandwich or I don't know, like we went to the hospital cafe, we walked through like sprinklers and it wasn't a far walk, but like why that? Like that's weird. So I think he is like kind of naturally like a little odd and quirky, but as a child like, really fun and really, really silly. Yeah. And I mean, the maniacal stuff that gets sort of like, in this lore of who he was, again, I look back as an adult and I'm like, "Oh my that's, like, really sick and twisted." Like, he had this, like, sick side to him.
Say more. What is in this lore?
God,
What? Yeah.
there were these stories, like, he would in my family, we'd call him Crazy Willie stories. His name was Will Elder. I probably should mention this. Will Elder, is who we're talking about, and he, like, as a child in the Bronx, remember, like, youngest of 4, the closest age gap between him and his next sibling was 9 years. So really, like, disjointed with his siblings, they were so much older than him. And, like, there's this story where he cut out all these figures and he put them on a record player and, like, it was, like, a woman with a knife and a man running away, and he, like, shone a light on it and cast it against, like, a window shade and played the record, so it looked like if you were walking down the street and looked up at the window of their apartment in the Bronx, like, you would see this, like, harrowing sight of like, that's funny. But then there was another
Wow.
one where I think he, like, collected meat scraps from, like, the butchers in the Bronx and put clothing on them and threw them into the train tracks and was screaming like, "Oh, Moish," or, like, whoever like, whatever common Jewish name in their, like, Jewish immigrant community, and that's the one where I'm like, "Okay, that is that's not
That's
okay."
dark. But yeah, wow, that's still funny.
Yeah, yeah. So,
Wow, what an interesting character.
yeah.
Um, but I guess now I understand more about when you meant he loomed large in the family. What was that? What was your side of that? Like, what is it like to grow up with someone that, yeah, has not just is famous for his contributions, but he's also got like this massive personality. It sounds like, yeah. What was it like growing up in that environment?
I think I thought it was exciting because everyone around me thought like, everyone around me being my parents and my brother, and maybe, like, pieces of the extended family thought it was cool and exciting. But now, with some distance and years between that, I think, I wasn't really interested. I'm not interested in comics per se. Like I was interested in him and interested in the impact he had. But I think in some ways it warped the narrative. I picked a very stable career, like not a lucrative one, but a stable one where I have a retirement account and I've always had health insurance and I've always had these things that like, I don't know what he contended with and what he had to, maybe those things weren't priorities in the 50s. I don't really know. But like, then I look at the next generation of like my mom and my dad, and then I look at my brother and I think that like, because of some of the like that narrative of like you can chase your dreams and make it happen. I think the flip side to that is you could struggle in that pursuit. And so somewhere along the lines, I got the messaging that I wanted stability. Even if it wasn't like highly lucrative, I wanted to do what I wanted to do. So I wanted to help people, but I found a way to do that that was sort of rooted in stability.
Interesting. When you were saying like the other side of that with your parents and brother, what I guess yeah, maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on the other side of it, the instability. Like, what is it that you're reacting to in your seek for something more secure?
Well, and I don't know that this necessarily plays into my grandfather's narrative, but like my dad as an editor, his career has lived through some wild times. Like, back in the 80s and 90s, it was the heyday, and he worked at the largest post-production studio on the East Coast, and he had like, really cool and like he did have stability. But then after 9/11, like the industry kind of changed in New York. And he went freelance. And so from 2001 until today, he's 73 and, still kind of working. I remember being, a kid and or a teen and like every year having a new health insurance card, like, he has type 1 diabetes, so like the health piece is really significant. And so just watching like that, the instability with which he had no control. And then I mean, my mom had a career in publishing and then early childhood. So I don't really have as much of an example with that. But then when I look at my brother who's chosen to follow the creative path, he's worked at coffee shops and the trade-off is huge, and it's been a struggle for me who's fairly, I would define myself as like a little rigid and concrete. Like, I'm like, oh my God, you're working at a coffee shop. Like, don't you need to choose something, but also not wanting to be a naysayer. 'Cause I very much believe, and I know this is, like, a mindset of people who have creative pursuits. It's like you don't plan for a plan B, or else it doesn't happen. And so I want him to find success, and he's actually working at a healthcare startup right now, and he has a kid, and so he's, you know, trying to figure out his path as well. But I think I just saw, between like no fault of his own, my dad's industry changing also right before his eyes. And then this dedication to your passions and your dreams without maybe a larger picture or plan. I think that's what I'm reacting to.
The point about the industry is really, really interesting because it can be might have nothing to do with ability. Like your brother and grandfather could have the same ability, your brother could be better, but the industry is very different now than it was in the fees, where I imagine just the opportunities are not what they used to be. But yeah, say more about that side of it. I don't know. I'm curious how you've seen this evolution, and you have multiple people in your family that are adjacent to that industry and have to deal with the fact that it's not just something that they can control, but it's how the world is changing around them.
Yeah. I'm not intimately familiar with the industry, but I know that um with my grandfather, he could, walk into a building and show his art, and, someone could say you're hired. Or like, it was a more accessible time in a way. Like we have so many, channels of communicating with each other and being plugged in, but it's really it's a facade because we can't really touch the people we want. And I think he grew up, I'm talking about my grandfather, he came up with a cohort of people who were doing these cool things. Like Stan Lee was a contemporary, and I think it's a bit of right place, right time in a budding industry. Like, Mad Magazine was sort of the first of its kind, I believe, where it offered like a satirical narrative to the culture at large. So he was also doing something that was new. Yeah, I don't really know. And then for my dad and my brother, I guess particularly my dad, like, today is a different story even than it was 5 years ago, because like AI and our tech capabilities have just totally skyrocketed. But we were seeing this, with like the programs that Mac was or Apple was putting out 15, 20 years ago with like Final Cut Pro, and him, operating off of these behemoth of machines and software and programs that were so expensive. And then COVID hit. Like he was working at NBC when COVID hit and everyone went home, and then, they, after, so much time, decided that these floors taken up with this expensive equipment and demanding that everybody come there was a waste. It was inefficient. And so I remember he got a laptop from NBC to be able to work from home, and he was like, I can't believe that I could do everything I need to do on this slender piece of equipment. So, tech has completely revolutionized in the, 50 years that he's been at it. Yeah.
And so shifting gears a bit to your career and let me say more about the nature of the work and maybe to the point that we're just making now, whether it's technology or how things have changed. Like, what have you seen happening in social work? Are things changing? I mean, I'd imagine a lot of this stuff is still obviously relying on people helping each other, but what's that industry like?
Yeah. So in many ways, it's been consistent. When I started working, I was working predominantly in the Bronx with individuals with cognitive impairments and disabilities. And I think about that time of like it being a real hustle. Like I had to have a huge caseload in order to make my numbers and, bang out reports and do all this work that was really intense emotionally really fast. And I bet you that piece of it has only gotten worse. I don't really work in a clinical capacity any longer, but I think that's gotten worse. And I say that because our needs have just gotten higher as a society. Like we're so in need of healers and helpers. And, whether you look at the economy or you look at the like the impacts of the pandemic or you look at mental health rates, like we are kind of reeling and have been for a while. So I think the need has only grown, and um I think it's only gotten harder to be that pillar for people because we're so burdened with the high needs.
What are some examples for people? Like, 'cause I feel like social work is one of those careers that a lot of people have heard about, but I would imagine that most don't really know
Yeah.
much about what it entails. Yeah, give some examples or go a little bit deeper into it.
Sure. I mean, it's like everything. So it's really general, and that I've loved that, and I've had trouble with that because you can really do many, many things. You can be a therapist. If you see somebody with an LCSW after their name, which is the credentials that I have, that could be your therapist. You could be hospitalized and need to be discharged to a rehab facility if, like, let's say you broke your knee, and a social worker would be responsible for discharging you to that nursing home facility or the rehab facility. Social workers are in mental health clinics. They're working with people who are experiencing homelessness, addictions. Like it's really all these areas of helping people. So the more clinical side of social work is therapy. The more there's like more of an administrative function where you're in leadership and supervising, and that's probably true of many industries. There's more like resource based parts of the field where you're helping people get insurance or you're helping them sign up for public benefits or housing or getting their basic needs met. So there's really a variety of places you'd find a social worker.
You mentioned that it can be emotionally intense. Say more about that.
I think this is what drew me to social work at the beginning was like you're walking alongside people in varying degrees of crisis. You're really getting a snippet of their lives at some of the hardest and best chapters. But it's something that actually pulled me away from the clinical work was when I was working in the Bronx. I was doing therapy with individuals with cognitive impairments, and I just felt like I could be the world's best therapist, and I was never gonna change what these people were living, like their lives and their environments and, going home to roach-infested apartments or abuse and neglect. And so I think you're just really face to face with some of the deepest challenges that people have in their lives. And doing that every day for multiple people, and by multiple I mean like 40, like that's a lot.
Wow. Wait, so this feeling of, I don't know, I guess like helplessness that you can be amazing at your job and you're still barely making a dent. What does it take to actually make a difference? Yeah, what can be done?
So what I found and what I chased was policy. I went to grad school saying I'm going to be a therapist and I'm going to work with people in private practice and, I'm going to just have this more like clean cut experience. And then I had a policy professor my first year who sort of really blew open my mind to how policy could impact change or affect change. And then that just became the path I wanted to chase. So I knew in this relatively low paying field, I wanted to get like the highest credentials. So I got my clinical licensure through all those years of therapy and clinical experience. But then I sort of pivoted and wanted to find where like the rules were being made, and that leads you to policy. So for a time I worked at Mount Sinai in New York and did what I kind of call where the rubber meets the road. Like I was doing benefits and entitlements eligibility work, but what I really needed to do was be well versed in like the laws and rules around health insurance and public benefits in order to deliver those services to people and in order to educate other providers at the hospital. So this is like a long-winded way of answering, but I think that it's policy, in my opinion, when you can change the rules and you can change the laws, or you can have an influence in what those rules and laws say, that is how you change people's lives.
What are some examples of policies that if you can change, you would?
Okay, so I have a very specific example. So in my current form, I am an adjunct professor at the University of Denver. And before I did that exclusively, I was working at the VA here in Colorado. And I had a very, very niche role for a time, helping veterans who had like really advanced dementia, helping them with decision making. And so, or helping them with like the legal and formal channels of decision making. So, advanced directives and legal guardianship and these kinds of things. And so, if I could change a policy to affect better change, I would change the HIPAA law. So, we're dreaming real big here. But I think if you could change some of HIPAA and how it plays out at the hospital level of a VA in terms of who you can talk to and releasing information, you would break down a barrier that helped veterans get their decision-making needs met in a far less bureaucratic way. So, I mean, that's really big to really small.
Well, no, but say more about that. It's so interesting because obviously people, like most people, know HIPAA is the privacy safeguards that are
Hmm.
there to protect us. And your point is that in some cases can actually be really damaging to specific patients who can't make all those decisions themselves. They need to entrust others to do it, but HIPAA gets in the way. Is that sort of the gist of it, or how does it work?
So, I would explain it as this weird catch-22. And I'm talking about the VA particularly. So we're talking about a federal organization with many, many, many layers of bureaucratic policy. So the VA doesn't only follow HIPAA as a privacy law. There are like 5 other federal policies that get layered over them. So I just want to make it as clear as it actually can be that we're talking about like a specific thing. It's different than like, the hospital around the corner from you. But so when you have someone who's been clinically deemed to not be able to make decisions, legally they can make all their decisions, but in the clinical setting of a hospital, we don't let them. And we defer to, if they have an advance directive, whoever they've appointed. But a person who acts as a power of attorney can't make certain like huge decisions. You can't move them out of state. You can't sell their house. You can't do things against their will. And what I mean by that is like, if they clinically, cognitively, functionally need a nursing home, but a person disagrees and has this advanced dementia and no clinical ability to make decisions, legally they still can.
You were saying like the individual themselves
Yeah.
can make that decision, so they could have dementia, they could do all this, even though it's clear to everybody else that they should be in a nursing home, that individual could say, "No, I'm not going to a nursing home," and that's
Yes.
that.
That's that. And it's really like if anyone listening knows this world at all, like it's a huge problem and people get stuck in the hot like the layers of problems are so many because there's this autonomy piece, there's this safety piece, there's the family piece, there's all these pieces, and then there's also this very real piece of people are getting stuck in the hospital. And you get stuck in the hospital for 300 days, who's paying that bill? Like, it's just crazy.
Yeah, 'cause the alternative is not that they're going home and they're living in their houses. The alternative is they're in a hospital, which is even more costly. It's much more costly than a nursing home.
Yeah, and well,
Nursing
and
homes are not
sending them
cheap.
home is assuming they have a home, they have a family. Like many times, especially with the veteran population, veterans they live more rural, they live more independently, they might not, like statistically, they are just a little more like rugged individuals who don't ask for things of people. So you have a myriad of issues, but coming back to like the HIPAA piece, when you have a person who clinically lacks the ability to make decisions and doesn't have a designated authority. So, like, if you had nobody designated to help you make decisions and you can't make your own decisions, and you have a brother who says, I'm going to be your decision maker, the VA can't provide him with the clinical paperwork he needs to go pursue a legal authority over you. They can't do it legally because of these layers of policy that protects in some ways protects you, but I'm highlighting this kind of very niche flip side where your brother, if he's going to become your fiduciary or your legal power of attorney, or not legal power of attorney but your legal guardian, I'm sorry, your conservator or your guardian, he can't pursue that without clinical documentation, but we can't give it to him because he has no legal rights. So that's the catch 22. And so I remember when I worked at the VA, I was in intimate contact with our team of our general counsel. And I said, like, obviously I'm not going to go do this, but what would it take? Just tell me what it would take for me to hand you this paper. Like, what would it be? And that's where we landed. It was like you needed to amend parts of HIPAA and parts of, our informed decision making processes. So I don't know.
Wow.
I feel like I've dug myself into this very murky hole.
No, I think it's great to get, yeah, an idea of how complex these issues are, and they might seem like it's a pretty straightforward thing, but it's not. But listen, let me ask you this: why can't that HIPAA language be changed? Like, are there people on the other side that are pushing back? Do they have some arguments, or is it mostly just an awareness thing, or it's such a niche thing that people haven't bothered to think through it?
I think this brings us into like a legal area that I am not totally well versed in, but it's a congressional thing. Like you need like someone in Congress to propose that the language gets changed. Like it's certainly a function of our lawmakers at the federal government to change federal law.
I'm curious also about the settings in which you've worked. You've worked at Mount Sinai. You've worked with people in the Bronx in New York City, but then you've also worked with veterans. What do you see about those different demographics? And you already alluded to some of these, like the veterans being a little bit more rugged and independent. Be curious, yeah, if you can go deeper on either side of it. Like, what is it like to work with these different populations, even though the job might be similar, but the populations are very different, and I imagine that can make the actual work pretty different.
Yeah, certainly. It's hard to answer that without sort of like threading my own personal affection into it. Like before I graduated with my MSW, I did an internship with individuals with intellectual disabilities, and then I went and did that as like my first job out of grad school. And I think what I loved about working with that population was like the normalcy of the experiences. Like you might have a person with Down syndrome who is stereotyped and typecasted, and you look at a person with different needs and make assumptions. But what I loved was when we did a lot of in my internship, there were like a lot of work programs, and one of the things I had to do was like help this they had a flower business and they would sell flowers, and just giving people the opportunity to shine and be just like you and me.
So who is this that had a flower business? Like someone with Down syndrome?
Yeah, it was an agency I worked for in New Jersey when I was an intern, and the agency started a flower business, and the people who were the agency had group homes, so people who lived in their group homes could work in the flower business, and they would go to various locations in the community and sell flowers on Fridays. And me as an intern would accompany them, and we would, collect the money, count the money, and sell the flowers and do what we had to do. And I think just giving people, like, this is more of like an equity comment, but it's like giving someone the opportunity to just be a member of the community and show up. And so that was, there was something really sweet and beautiful with working with that population.
What's it like from their perspective to go and actually contribute to your point, be a member of the community, and to ultimately do something that has economic value and get paid for it?
Yeah. I think it's incredibly empowering. I think, different for everybody based on their diagnoses and, ability to tolerate certain environments. But the empowering nature of it, I think, can't be understated. I think you would see lots of different issues fall to the wayside or lessen when someone was given a purpose and a role and a plate. Like we would go to schools, we would see children, we would see, we would go to like community centers and see the elderly, like, just like out in the world, just like everyone else. And so I think that autonomy and that purpose is pretty life changing, but it's the truth for everybody. So it's really just it's when we have purpose and a role and can be seen. So I think the beauty in it is like you might like your average Joe might see somebody and say like, poor them, or oh this or oh that, whatever story you make up. But the truth is we're all just very similar on varying degrees.
Are there any specific stories that stand out of some of these disabled individuals that went through a program like this and came out the other side?
I can't I mean, it was so long ago, I can't remember one. I mean, I remember the group home that I was like placed at in my internship and all like the cool things we did, like we made pizza or we, went and played basketball or whatever. Like they had their lives and their challenges, and it was kind of my job to go in and do what they wanted to do, kind of like, oh, you want to make pizza, like, all right, great, we're going to figure out how to, like, let's go to the grocery store, let's go do these things, let's, make it happen.
What about from the perspective of the families? And I know multiple people that have neurodivergent kids, and they're sort of going through some of that now. And then, especially in the beginning, I imagine it's extremely scary. There's a lot of uncertainty. You don't know how your child's gonna end up growing up. But what did you interact much with the families themselves? Like, what are some of the things that's helped them?
Well, so when I worked in the Bronx, I worked for an agency in New York called AHRC. And I was predominantly based in the Bronx when I worked there. And then one of the things I did on the side, because as a social worker, you always need a side hustle. I worked on Saturdays in this program they had called SIB Shops. And SIB Shops is like a national, I don't know the state of affairs with it now, but at the time it's a national model, and it was a program for the siblings of children with disabilities. And I loved that. And that was a way to interface with the family. So from that perspective, statistically the siblings of those with disabilities are like highly successful, highly accomplished, because of this need to kind of be easy for your parents and not make waves for your parents because they have someone else that has a lot more needs, and to make them proud and outperform. And so this space was just for them in a world where their sibling had all these needs and all these appointments and all these providers and interventions. They had a space where they could go and just experience their own thing. And we did more therapeutic interventions, and we did like completely not therapeutic interventions, just like, fun stuff. And they could relate to other kids who were in their situation. Um, and again, this is it. This was for all of the 5 boroughs. And the culminating thing we did in the program was bring them upstate to a camp. And so the agency AHRC has a camp in upstate New York that the individuals who get services from the agency can go to every year. They can spend time in the summer at a sleepaway camp, but we took the siblings there for like a weekend. And so that's like one slice of the family piece, was helping the more typical sibling.
Oh, that's such a powerful thought around. Yeah, you don't even think about the impact that it has on the other siblings, and it obviously does. I mean, it's hard on the parents, but let alone for, yeah, a kid similar age. And
Yeah,
yeah, and to hear your point, what we were talking about earlier about, growing up in people's shadows and how that impacts your own life. Like, yeah, like those kids also cast a shadow, and they have to, in some ways, like their siblings have to grow up faster than they might have otherwise.
completely. Yeah, it's complicated, and I feel you don't really hear much about it. And there are, like, some books, and I feel like you can point to some movies, like, the movie Love Actually, like, there's a character who has a sibling with, like, a profound mental illness, and but that's, like, the only thing that comes to mind, so I feel like it's common, especially, like, as we see rates of people with these, diagnoses increase, we don't hear much about that sibling experience, and then for the families, I mean, geez, it's now that I'm a parent, I think about this sometimes, and it's like I remember working with parents who were just fear-ridden and devastated, and that fear of you want your kid to outlive you always, but what happens when they can't fend for themselves? Like, what does that look like? So, watching parents stay in their caregiver role through their 80s. That's a hard role to play. And so the agency I worked for, and this is true of other agencies, had supports and structures in place to aid with that, whether it was, establishing a special needs trust or finding housing for the person. It really just depended on the individual's ability, like if they were able to live independently or not. But yeah, the agency I worked for certainly had services and supports for the parent side of things, because you know, you and I have young kids, and we could think about this from, our places like, 30, 40-year-olds, but what happens when you're 80, um, and you have an adult child that still depends on you?
Yeah, no, that stuff, I mean, I can't. And in some ways, counting the days until my daughter is off to college and I can
I
sleep
know.
again, and like, yeah, let alone when it's like, oh yeah, it's never gonna end. I can't even imagine it.
Yeah, yeah.
What about on the veteran side? What was that community like? What were some of the challenges that they were experiencing?
So when I worked face to face with veterans, I was working with the aging population. So it was mostly Vietnam vets, dwindling number of World War II vets, Korean War, so older, and it's a different animal than, people leaving the military today. But I mean, I have loved working at the VA. I loved the population. I loved the honor, the duty, the sense of purpose. I thought it was really palpable from just being in the building. And I thought that the people that worked there were pretty high quality, pretty serious people. So I think, we're in a funny time, and the government gets a bad rap sometimes, but the VA was probably the most serious, purpose, mission driven place I've really worked, and you feel that from the providers who take a ton of pride in serving those who served, and you feel that from the veterans themselves who thank you for showing up to work and helping them out too. You have these nuances of or not nuances, like these qualities, like I was mentioning before, this like rugged individualism. Like I remember once helping someone who, needed housing support. Like I think they were housed, but they couldn't afford their payments, and they really needed support, and they didn't want to take it because they thought they were taking from someone else who needed it. And you don't find that, I don't think, in all sectors of the population, but there's this sort of like camaraderie. We're in it together. We're going to help our brothers and sisters. And, I'm not going to take from you if your needs are higher. Yeah. And I mean, what really manifested in the subset of the population I worked with, so like the aging Vietnam era folks, was I'm not depending on anybody. I'm not asking for anything. I can take care of myself. And that, I think that's the more complex side of those qualities, because when you have, advanced stages of dementia and you do need to be taken care of, it makes it complicated.
Wow, yeah. You're also a professor. What kind of things do you teach? What do you research? How is the academic side played into your career?
Yeah, so I stepped away from the VA last September, because of my growing family. So I have two young kids, and I'm pregnant with my third. I wasn't pregnant at the time that I left, but I really felt more of the pull to be at home, and be more present with the kids. And I had taught as an adjunct professor since moving to Denver I started teaching in 2018. I moved here in 2017. So it's been something that I've done sort of like I mentioned, you always need a side hustle as a social worker. And so when I was looking to kind of step back a little, I knew I couldn't, get out of anything cold turkey. Like I still need to work and use my brain. Um, so I went back to teaching, and I prefer teaching the policy classes. So I've taught, some of the more foundational intro level classes to social work, which would be like human behavior and the social environment and, different clinical skills. But I like to teach healthcare policy and mental health care policy and the intro to policy classes because I feel like those are classes where first of all, I think a lot of students are more clinically tracked. They want to go and they want to go into more like of the what seems to be exciting, like, mental health stuff. But I'm really passionate and I think that I can share my passion and communicate the policy side in a way that is not boring, or at least that's my hope. But I think it's so impactful, and I think we need people who are interested and well versed in this area of not only social work, but it's everybody. Everybody needs to know about policy, in whatever field they're in. I that's those are the subject matters that I prefer to live in. And it's been a weird time to teach healthcare policy because everything is changing so quickly. And so one of the I guess the focuses that I try to share with my students is around this idea of learning how to learn. Um, we were talking before about like kindergarten and our kids, but like that's what I hope for my soon to be 5-year old, and that's what I hope for the 20 something year old students that I teach now. It's like you have to learn how to learn. You have to know how to find information that is reliable and true, and you need to be able to synthesize it as well. So that's something that I think regardless of the classes I'm teaching, try to impart. And then as far as research, I don't, at this moment, I'm not doing any research, but very excitingly, people I was working with at the VA got funding to do some research around guardianship. So legal guardianship, it was my area of expertise. And an area that had not been formalized through the VA prior to my role. So my role at the VA was the first of its kind across the country. And so the way the VA works is, you have this VA hospital and there's a spinal cord injury social worker in Albuquerque and in Denver and in, Omaha and New York. And so it's just like replicated across the system. But our VA here created this role that I got to occupy. And so I've had this fervor about what I found and the work that I did that I want to, do more with and bring to light because our population's aging and this isn't going away. And so I was at the time when I was still at the VA, I was working with a psychologist, and we published a paper and she got some funding. So in the new year, I believe we'll be doing some work more formally from a research perspective around guardianship.
Is one of the goals, whether it's explicit or not, to change some of these HIPAA laws and to make it easier to get?
Well, I think anyone who could hear me say that would think I'm just crazy. So I would say the goal would be to formalize a process. And the challenge you get, like many things federally, is the states are all doing their own thing. Colorado's legal guardianship laws are different than New York's and Florida's and California's. And so um but when I was still at the VA, I was like banging this drum that I don't know who was listening to of like, we need formal processes. We need to be familiar with this. We can't have it be just like a tertiary thought that people are not trained in. Like people are getting stuck in the hospital. They're getting, they're at the end of their life and they have no decision maker. They have legal rights that they shouldn't be using. Like it's just complicated. And so I think my large scale goal for the VA, which I'm not affiliated with any longer, would be a formalization. And then, nationally is also a bit of a mess. Like I don't believe there are good ways of tracking like the number of people in this country who have a legal guardian. And so I think if I'm dreaming big and reaching wide, it's sort of getting a handle on this topic because again, like I always felt like Chicken Little screaming the sky is falling, but like the population's aging and the truth is our systems are not outfitted to accommodate that, whether it's in this domain or others.
Do you feel like there are opportunities for startups to address some of these topics? And I feel like, yeah, like we're seeing more as millennials are getting older, like the tech digital native people are getting older. They're starting to innovate in areas that historically there hasn't been much innovation. And I kind of got a bunch of people innovating in the whole like death space and how to deal with this industry it's very antiquated, and now there are apps and things that make it easy to run funerals and burials and all that. And so it's, yeah, to your point about the population aging, and as our generation has to deal with our parents that are aging and have to care for them, do you feel like there's a place for innovation in that?
Absolutely. I think it takes better minds than mine, but I've had conversations sort of in like strange chapter of my life that I see myself in where I'm not full time in the field and I'm teaching and I'm raising kids and it's just kind of like a funky time. But I've had conversations with people because again, like I have this belief that I'm sitting on a golden egg. Like I have this knowledge and I have this experience. Again, it's very niche, but like let's do something with it. Let's figure out how to solve these problems and let's let technology be our guide or our help. And so I've had conversations with tech people here in Colorado sort of about like this marriage of solving problems in a social way and how we can have the tech help. And so like one thing that I've talked about, which I think the guardianship piece is just a little more complicated. I mean, it's a lot more complicated, but from a like hospital discharge perspective, like what if we had like a hotels.com equivalent where like you're not replacing social workers in the hospital, but you're giving them a tool to seamlessly find a good place for a person with a specific set of needs and insurance and age and all these things. Because this might sound wild to you, but you could sit in the hospital waiting to be discharged for days because you're waiting on people to call each other back. Like you're the nurse at the nursing home and you didn't answer the phone, so I left you a message and I sent you a fax. Like, these areas and industries are operating with those. And I know we're scared to not want to replace the people necessarily. I had a conversation with someone recently who said the work shortage or the staffing shortages in healthcare will not be solved with more people. Like that's just not going to be how we solve it. So, for all the tech minds listening, like there's a lot of problems to solve and there's a lot of people who can identify those problems but then might not know what to do about them. So, there's definite opportunities for a marriage here.
I love that so much because I have conversations with a number of technical people. To your point, they're just looking for an idea or they have something, but they don't have enough life experience to really understand the nature of what problems exist. And so to create this marriage between someone who's worked in these industries for a while, understands the issues, and then to figure out ways to solve those problems. I think it's awesome. No, to your point, it is a growing industry. There's more and more people that need these types of services, and it sounds like there are a lot of inefficiencies that can only be improved. So it's
Yeah. Well, and I think everyone who interfaces with the healthcare system experiences that on varying levels. Talk to any woman who's given birth or any family who's had someone give birth and you get like 17 different bills and you're like, what do I pay? What don't I pay? There's 1,000 places to strike. And, my area of expertise, like I keep saying, is just so random and nuanced, but I know it really well and I want to it.
Yeah. Well, it's almost like there should be a business that match makes founders, people that have like in
Mm.
your shoes with some technical people to start businesses. Cause it's, yeah, I think it's a really interesting, yeah. And it's for a good purpose, right? You come up with one of these solutions and you end up, making a large impact. Maybe I don't know, a place to end this conversation is with children. Like we're talking about your childhood. You now have two kids. You're pregnant with your third and final, as you were telling me. What? How do you think about being a parent, being a mother? How do you think about raising kids today? The types of jobs and careers that you might want them to go explore, or just even interest if it's too hard to try to figure out what the careers of the future are going to be. Like, how do you think about now that you're in the position that your parents and grandparents were in with your kids? What do you want from their lives?
I mean, so I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and I have a husband who runs a family business in, like, construction, and we're about to have 3 girls. And not that any of that, negates any opportunities, but my kids will just have a different opportunity set than I did, and I think, my husband and I are both, like, master's level people, like, we both have master's degrees, and I'm really serious and have spent a lot of time recently thinking sort of about this question, like, how do I intentionally raise my children to do good with their lives, good with their privilege, and, also honor their dreams? Like, that is something that was passed on to me for sure. And I don't want anyone to honor their dreams at the expense of reality, but I also want them to be fulfilled. And I think I don't have a hope or a dream for what their future careers could hold, but I think the example that I want to set is number one, my life and purpose as their mother is multidimensional. It's not just raising them or it's not just a career, it's many things. And my profession is really important, not only to me and my identity, but to the greater good. And I do something that matters. So I want them to know and see that. And I also want them to know and see that we as a family help people and do good for people. So whether they go into a field that has no sort of beneficence to it, that's something that is a part of them. So I just hope that they choose something that they are passionate about, that feeds them, but that they also have this broader view of the world that they can interact with in a positive way.
Yeah, it's a lot. But having kids puts everything in perspective from your values to how you want to raise them and teach them things, but also turn their character into something that can resonate positively with the world. So yeah, a lot to think about. No, Lara, this is awesome. It was really, really fun to hear about your life, your family, your career, and to learn more about your industry and the impacts that it's having and some of the challenges. So, yeah, thank you so much for sharing all this with us.
Yeah, anytime. This took us in lots of different ways.
Yeah, no, that's what I love about this. Is like you never know which direction it's going to go, and
Yeah.
you always learn something.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you for having me. It was
Yeah,
great to talk
thank
to you.
you.